Hi, this is Dr. Michael Bordeaux again, and we're moving on to our next lecture topic, which is a brief lecture considering the history of the state known as Israel, or of the people known as the ancient Hebrews or the ancient Jews. Now, our origins of the Israeli state starts coming out of out of references in the Bible, the book of Genesis, which refer to an individual by the name of Abram. From what we can gather from biblical evidence, Abram, it states, was left the city of Ur and traveled to the west, settling eventually in the land of Canaan. And Abraham, as he will later be called, of course, is the archetype or the patriarch of the Israeli people, and basically that is the kind of the beginning of their particular history and culture. Now, the key to understanding the mindset as well as the history of the ancient Hebrews or the Israeli people is to understand their religious identity, which is contained in the idea of the so-called Jewish covenant. Now, another word for covenant is like a contract. And what the ancient Israelites believed is that through the actions of their patriarch Abraham and the actions of a nameless God, if you will, who is subsequently sometimes referred to as Jehovah or Yahweh, the identity of the Israeli people is that they have made a unique contract with this nameless God, and that they will be his people and he will be their God. And as part of this contract is the idea that the Israelites have to follow the commandments of their God, and in return, their God will take care of them and will shower basically his favor upon them. And that's why, if you're familiar with this subject or material related to it, the Israelites refer to themselves as the chosen people because they are basically designated above all other peoples as having this significant special relationship with their God. And over time, their God, their belief in their God will kind of evolve to being what we call not only monotheistic, which means that they worship one God, but being what we call exclusive monotheistic, which means that they believe that there is in fact only one God, their God. And if we then take a look at the later events of Jewish history, we see, for example, the story of Israel, and that's where the name Israel comes from. It's a name change from an individual who was originally called Jacob, who then gets a name change into Israel and will then have 12 sons. And that then sets up kind of the cultural or the tribal nature of the Israeli people, and that they identify themselves as being descendants of Israel, who was a distant descendant from Abraham. And they are broken up based on his 12 sons, or the so-called 12 tribes of Israel. And let me move this out of the way for you. As the story then goes, the internal history of the Hebrew people, and we got to be careful when we take a look at the Bible as strictly a historical document. And the reason for that is very basic. The Bible represents an internal religious history for the Israeli or for the Jewish people. It was never meant to be read by people who were not Jewish. It was never meant to be studied or to be anything more than an internal history. And so we have to be careful when we use it as a purely historical document because it contains not only history, but it also contains morality and teachings that relate specifically to the cultural identity of the Hebrew people. And so we just got to be a little careful when we use it as a historical document. But be that as it may, it still represents a very good source of information for this early period of Israeli history. Now, the Bible goes on to say that at some point, the Hebrew people journeyed into Egypt. They left their land of, quote, Canaan, journeyed into Egypt, and eventually became slaves. And as the Bible states, it's because of their sinfulness that they did, in fact, become slaves. Now, The problem that we have to collaborate this is that we do have extensive Egyptian records, but they do not make a single reference or mention of the Israeli people. And while that might seem kind of, it seems awful convenient if, in fact, the events of the Bible did play out in a similar fashion to what we're told, it would make perfect sense that the Egyptians would basically scour their documents and remove any mention of the Hebrews. However, what we do have record of in terms of Egyptian records is we definitely have records stating that Egypt, the government of Egypt in the New Kingdom, basically conquered and incorporated Canaanite peoples as slaves into Egypt. And as we take a look at that, that's what we have records of that. As we take a look at that, that kind of gives at least historical collaboration that the ancient Israelites were in fact in Egypt in slavery by the time of the New Kingdom. Doesn't mean that we can necessarily say that they came into Egypt in the time period of the New Kingdom. In fact, tradition kind of holds that they might have entered into Egypt in the Middle Kingdom. But be that as it may, we have definite records supporting the conquest of Canaan during the New Kingdom. If we fast forward, however, what the Bible then tells us is that for hundreds of years, the Israeli people suffered in slavery, and yet eventually, basically repenting of their evil or sinful ways, they then reestablished their contractual arrangement with their God. And we have, of course, the resultant event of that, which is the so-called Exodus, or the person of Moses being sent to kind of help the Israelis out of their problems. So we traditionally date Moses to about 13 to 1200. We date him to correspond to the reign of Ramses II. And it's at that point that we believe that the Israelis did in fact leave the slavery of Egypt and migrate back into their, quote, promised land, or the land of Canaan, sometimes between the 1200s and the 1100s. And this is kind of linked to what other cultures refer to as a mass migration period of the so-called Sea Peoples, among which were the Philistines, and which might have also been the Israelis leaving Egypt. We see a lot of migration and a lot of people moving into the Middle East in the 12 and 1300s. This is probably our second major wave, if you will, of migrations into the area. And we basically have some political destabilization that collaborates the events that are depicted in the book of Genesis. So, for example, we have the destruction of the city of Jericho, which is known as Ai Hazor, around the year 1200. So we have the destruction of Jericho about that time by a group of people that we can't necessarily identify. Further archaeological evidence supports that an influx of new peoples came into the urban areas of the Middle East and destabilized them around 1200. We then date the origins of the Israeli state to sometime around that 1100 period. And we know that according to the books of the Bible, again, that they went through a period of what we call theocratic government, which means, very simply put, ruled by God. And the so-called judges, as they were called in the Bible, represented spiritual authority in human form. And then as we trace kind of the period of Judges through the next set of books of the Bible, which are called the books of Kings, we then believe we see a political evolution of the Jewish state to having a monarchy as opposed to these non-heretical kind of spiritual representatives. The first monarchy is the first king of the Israeli people is called Saul, King Saul, or the Seleucid dynasty. And then we have a period of about, give or take, about 120 years where the Israeli state is growing, expanding, and continues to be unified. So if we take a look at the next slide, we have the so-called Seleucid dynasty, which is going to last a fairly brief period of time from about the 1050s until about 10,000 or 1007. And during this time period, we have a series of wars that are going to break out between the Philistines, which were one of these sea peoples, and the Israelis, that are both peoples are trying to carve out a state to dominate the area. And just before we move on, just to let you know, this would be the land of Canaan, basically. And the state of Israel is traditionally located basically near the coast of what is today modern-day Palestine on the Mediterranean Sea. And it borders right up to the Sinai Peninsula and basically the boundary of Egypt. Now, in terms of that first monarchy or that first imperial dynasty, Saul would be king, but he would die in battle with the Philistines. And then we have the remaining sons of Saul that will kind of shepherd Israel during the time period of the rise of the individual we call David. And basically it's going to be the death of Saul and the reign of one of Saul's younger sons, Ishbosheth, that's going to open the door for David to kind of take the reins of government, and he will kill off the sons of Saul and kill off that dynasty and establish a new dynasty that we call the Davidic dynasty or the dynasty of David. Now, David would have multiple wives. He would be married approximately, I think it's 8 times, and he would have numerous children. And as we continue to trace the history of the Israeli people under David, while we see expansion and fairly large and widespread economic growth and stability, we see an increasing instability in the ruling family. David would spend most of his later years of life fighting with his sons in order to maintain control of the state of Israel. Eventually, of course, we have the death of David in 967, and we have the ascension of one of David's youngest sons in the form of Solomon. It's at this point, of course, that we have the creation of the so-called Temple of Solomon, or the Temple of Jerusalem, that it will later be called when it's rebuilt. We have the foundation of the temple, and we have the height of the Israeli kingdom, as the slide points out. But that height is extremely short-lived, because with the death of Solomon and the succession of Solomon's son Rehoboam, we have the outbreak of civil war, and we have the splitting of the kingdom of Israel into 2 separate countries, which we commonly refer to as Israel, which would be the northern kingdom, and it would be much larger. And we have the smaller southern kingdom of Judah. And again, going back to that idea of the so-called 12 tribes of Egypt, we have 10 of the tribes splitting and consolidating to the north in terms of Israel, and 2 tribes, the tribes of Benjamin and Judah, remaining unified and constituting this southern kingdom. Just to let you know, the kingdom of Judah, while it was smaller, it retained cultural superiority because the city of Jerusalem was still the capital of Judah, and that's where the temple was located. In an effort to kind of stabilize itself, the northern state of Israel would create a new city known as the city of Samaria, which would basically become its capital. But as time went on, Jewish people of the northern state of Israel increasingly began to forego traveling to Jerusalem according to their religious customs and practices. And as time went on, a large segment of the Jewish population in Israel ceased to be members of the Jewish religion. And that's how you have the creation of the term a Samaritan, or that is a term referring to those citizens of the state or of the area of Samaria. Now, during this time period, we have 2 separate timelines. We have two countries, 2 states operating in the area. We have the state of Israel and we have the state of Judah. Now, the state of Israel will have a shorter lifespan. It will last approximately, about give or take 208 years. And it will actually eventually fall prey to a rising state we've already kind of talked about, or will talk about, known as the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians basically dominated Israel and conquered it, and then scattered the so-called 10 tribes that lived there, scattered them across their empire, which was their normal political habit. They would basically conquer an area and then depopulate the area of about 3/4 to 1/2 of the population, and then move new people in and kind of jumble up the people and kind of rule them by this kind of fear and territory. The southern state of Judah survives longer. It survives until it will be conquered by a group of people referred to as the Neo-Babylonians. Again, if you remember, we talked about the Neo-Babylonians, and they are the last Middle Eastern civilization to actually rule the Middle East. And they grew and expanded and conquered the city of Judah in 586. They enslaved the people of Judah. They enslaved the Jews and kept them in slavery until they were conquered by the leader known as Cyrus the Persian in 539. And to just kind of give you the rest of the history of the state of Judah, the state of Judah would be reenacted or recreated in 539 by Cyrus the Persian. It would last until about 332, in which in the 330s it was conquered by the expanding Greeks and made part of the Greek Empire. When the Greek Empire broke up in 305, it was retained by one part of the Greek Empire, known as the Ptolemaics of Egypt. From that point forward, it was part of the Ptolemaic Empire until it was basically kind of wrested away by the Seleucid Empire in 198. It was controlled by the Seleucids until 141. And last but not least, it kind of had a brief period of independence in 141 to 63. And that was accomplished by the so-called Maccabean Revolt, which, if you're familiar with the Bible, the book of Maccabees kind of refers to these events. And then after that, we have the collapse of that kingdom of Israel, eventually to becoming a part of the Roman Empire from 63 all the way to the year 70. And in the year 70, in the aftermath of what's called the Roman-Jewish War, the Roman Empire then eventually destroyed the city of Jerusalem and scattered the Jewish people from the city of Jerusalem out throughout the Roman Empire. And the state of Israel as a state, or as even an identity, or as a place, ceased to exist. And it was that way for more than basically almost 1900 years. It was the state of Israel, in case you're wondering, was reconstituted or recreated again in the 1940s by the British government, and to a lesser extent by the American government in the aftermath of World War II. And that, just to let you know, is kind of the history of Israel in a nutshell. It's probably perhaps a little more detailed than you might have wanted, but that kind of outlines this so-called, chosen people, self-identified chosen people, and kind of the ups and downs of their history. Now, in case you're wondering, as we stress periodically when we talk about these civilizations, is, what is the effect or what is the legacy of the Israeli state or the Israeli people? And while politically, or perhaps even, technologically or culturally, their impact on world history is fairly small, it is more than made up with in the fact of their religious impact upon world history. The Jewish people are, as far as we can identify with any great degree of certainty, they are the first monotheistic religion, which means they are the first religion to actually worship one God. And that's quite impressive, considering that at that point in time, when the Israeli people were monotheistic, every other religion on the planet was polytheistic. Now, of course, as time went on, that monotheism continued to evolve to be what we called exclusive monotheism, and it would wind up forming the foundation for the two most probably influential and powerful and largest religions in the world today. And those religions that I'm referring to are, of course, the religion of Christianity and the religion of Islam, which are with Israeli religion or Jewish religion. They form a trifecta, if you will, of what we call the Abrahamic religious tradition, named after Abraham. And so the legacy of the Hebrews is their contribution to world religion and the creation of this foundational culture and religion, which would then give rise to the Christian religion and to the Islamic religion. And we'll talk about those religions later in terms of how they connect and the impact that they've had on world history, which, as you all know, has been extremely, extremely powerful in the scope of the development and course of human events. Once again, I thank you for listening to this video. It's probably a little longer than I wanted it to be. I hope that this answers a lot of your questions about the Israeli state. If you have additional questions, please email me, let me know, and look forward to seeing you again in our next lecture, which is going to basically talk about Persia. Once again, this is Dr. Michael Bardot. I thank you, and I look forward to speaking to you again.